Hello and welcome to the SciPhi show. I do apologize for being a little bit late today, but I was playing around with the settings as you do. Anyway, today we're going to be discussing a topic that I'm sure you're probably all sick to death of hearing about if you're one of our regular listeners and watchers. But for anybody who is new to this topic or hasn't heard of atheism being discussed as a proposition, that's what we're going to be discussing tonight. So hello and welcome to the SciPhi show. I'm Joe.
And I'm Dave, I think.
Just about. Somewhat Dave. Somewhat me.
Well, you can never really be sure. I mean, we could be in a brain in a vat. You know, I'm not really Dave. I'm just an approximation of some digital display.
And Dave's not here.
Quoteth the Cheech and Chong manual.
So I've been playing around with some of the settings a little bit recently. You might notice that things look a little bit different. We have sort of gone back to a windowed look today, and that's because our fake green screens were not good enough. So we've gone back to sort of this sort of format, but we're trying to keep it a bit simplistic. We are still experimenting with different ways to get the cameras in, and we're looking for the best way for when it's just the two of us and when there's lots of us and all of that business. So if you have any suggestions for the best free ways, I'm leaning towards the going back to Google Meet myself, because I found that had the best balance between a quality camera and ease of use. But there's plenty of other options available to us. Anyway, you're not here to hear me go on about set design. That's for us to organize. You're like, shut up, Joe. We're here to hear about atheism. Why are you here to hear about atheism? Well, because it can be discussed as a proposition. A proposition. Wow. So we should start off by discussing perhaps some of the initial confusion that comes around between things like the difference between a proposition, a claim, a belief statement, and a knowledge claim and a truth claim and all of that sort of thing. Sorry, what happened to the background you tried last time? I just switched it. I can switch through the backgrounds. I got a bunch of different backgrounds, and I was just playing with them. And this one was nice and simplistic. But you want that other one? I can just do this. Whee! Or if we're going for numbers, we're talking propositions, right? Well, maybe we go this one. Way. But yeah, they're all loaded into Streamlabs. Into Slobs. What we're doing right now is that they've got this new feature called where you can actually have your camera from your audience directly into the stream. At the moment, the free version only allows one person, so that's Dave. However, what I have noticed my end is my mouse and computer is sort of hanging every few seconds. It's not affecting the stream or the camera as far as I can tell, but when I try and move my mouse to click something, I sometimes have to wait a few seconds and then I can do it, which is why I'm thinking about switching back to having the cameras going through a different service. But yeah, so that's why that discussion is happening. But anyway, sorry. I guess you were here to hear about the setup. Ansfrida, don't worry. You haven't actually only missed 5 minutes. It's not even that. We haven't even really started yet. So there you go. We've had started late and then 4 minutes of waffle. Hey, Chesh, great to have you here as well. Anne Claire, Luke, Chris, Pierre, Kimo, Jordan, great to have you all here right at the start. Fantastic. Thank you. An Autistic Shield, great to have you here as well. You can hear crackling from my mic. That's interesting. Is that from me or is that from Dave? Because
considering I've not really said anything, it must be you.
It could be it. It's yeah. It could be me. I mean, we can't really hear it from your end. From you know what I mean, words. There was some crackling on my mic that Dave could hear earlier. But that's we couldn't hear that anymore. We did do a sound test at the start. But we definitely didn't leave enough time to set up again. We're not very well prepared. But okay. So it's when I speak loudly. It could just be it peaking then and coming back down. So the idea there should be that I shouldn't speak loudly. That's a bit difficult, seeing as I don't know how to speak any other way. All that time in theatre studies, learning to project your voice, sort of. I can always play with the hardware at some point. Probably. Oh, we've lost Dave as well. Dave's back.
I moved the thing to try to stop the flashing screen, and it jiggled the network cable, I'm guessing.
I'll jiggle your network cables.
I need to get little tassels so I can...
Let me see if I can just play with yours as well. Oh, hey. Randomly, you had a chroma key applied to you. I don't know why. So here we are, just setting up our audio right at the start of the stream. This is definitely what everybody is here for. In fact, your effects on you were completely the wrong way round as well. So I don't know what I did with yours. It's very strange, the things that are going on right now. Anyway, here we go. And Srida, yeah, so the backgrounds, we can use different ones at any point in time. It's just sort of what we're going to do. Yeah, so what the reason we've gone back from that is because we are our fake green screens weren't good enough, basically, and we are going to have different backgrounds depending on the topic and whatever suits us, but we're not going to go to having us floating in space until such time that we can get half decent green screens. We're going to get the ones that sort of clip to the back of your chair, because there's nothing that can sort of fit on them, but they cost money, and neither of us have much of that. So that's going to be one for the future, and then you can have us floating in space. Yes, indeed, Luke. What is atheism? The title is false. So anyway, let's restart then, shall we? Let's actually get things going. So we're going to be discussing atheism as a proposition. Atheism is obviously one of those polysemous terms, and that means it has many different definitions. It's had many different uses over the years, from its original atheos, which had a number of different definitions, to the various concurrent ones as well. And today we're going to be discussing how atheism can be used as a proposition and why we prefer that definition, the benefits it has, and some of the issues that we find with the other definitions. Now, we're not saying that you have to use our definition. There isn't only one definition. The important thing is so that we know what we're talking about. So with a term like atheism, it's important to clear up just what someone means by atheist when they use the term. And then you can use their definition for the conversation. Right? You can go, okay, we're using atheism as this for this conversation. You've got a stipulated use. But for this conversation, we're going to be using atheism as a proposition. So, what is a proposition? Well, we should discuss, first of all, some of the confusion with language between a proposition, a claim, a belief statement, and different types of claim. So Dave, when we say proposition, what do we mean?
A proposition is when you pull up at the side of the street late at night in the red light district and say, what can I get for 15 quid? Or, you know, it's a declarative statement that is truth apt about the world. Basically, it's some statement where you're describing the world and it's either true or false.
Yeah.
And
when you state a proposition, you're not necessarily saying anything about it one way or the other. You're not saying you necessarily think it true or false, are you?
No, not necessarily. If I say I have a bookshelf behind me, that's just me making a statement, and that statement's either true or false.
So we could say that a claim has something that has propositional content, but you're also making an assertion that this claim is true.
Or false, depending on the claim. Yeah. There is kind of an implicit claim within a proposition, and that's this statement describes some feature of reality, and it's that implicit claim that makes it either true or false. It's not a direct claim, just more kind of sits there and is part of what a proposition is.
So when someone says something, as you said, like, there is a bookshelf behind me, or it's going to rain tomorrow, it does sound like they're making a claim to most people, doesn't it?
Well, it's going to rain tomorrow could be considered to be a claim because it's not exactly propositional, because there is no truth maker.
Yeah, it's something in the future. It's one of the things that when it comes to claims, when it's something in the future, they say that it doesn't necessarily count as a proposition in itself, because, as you say, it's future truth apt, therefore it's not truth apt right now.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, you could say it is truth apt, but a proposition is something that kind of has propositional content. So if you say something like, that's a Coke can, the propositional content is that there's this object and it is a can and it's got Coca-Cola written on it and it probably had Coke in it at one point, although not the Al Pacino kind of Coke, obviously.
Amen.
And when spoken in any language, it always refers to the same thing, even if it's different words, kind of like numbers and numerals. So yeah, there is no actual content in a statement like it's going to rain tomorrow because there is no rain tomorrow yet. It's a future prediction rather than a declarative statement, even if it sounds like one.
Yes, yeah. So if we think about things like that could be said in that directly declarative statement, something that is truth apt. So by truth apt, we're talking about something that is either true or false. So this comes back to one of the rules of logic, basically, and so something that is truth apt isn't necessarily a claim that you're making. You could be presenting, say, a proposition. I could tell you that I have a glass of liquid down there. This is a truth apt statement. I either do or don't have a glass of liquid down there right now. Dave could make that statement. Joe has a glass of liquid down there. Now, Dave could be presenting that proposition without making that claim. It might sound that he's making that claim. But the other thing he could be doing is actually affirming the proposition that Joe has a glass of liquid down there. He's giving his read. He's saying he believes this to be true, even though he doesn't say, I believe Joe has a glass of liquid down there. He's saying, I believe Joe has a glass of liquid down there by saying Joe has a glass of liquid down there. He's not necessarily saying this is definitely true. And this is one of the things that sometimes gets people confused. He can be giving a read and he can be affirming a truth apt statement without using the word I believe. So it sounds to a lot of people that he is making a truth claim there. And I can understand why. And it's one of the reasons it's good to be explicit with our language and actually say, I believe Joe has a glass down there, or I think Joe has a glass down there, or it's likely Joe has a glass down there. Add that modifier into the language to make sure that people are certain that he's not saying, I know Joe has a glass down there, or it's definitely true that Joe has a glass down there. And that is part of the split. So simply saying a statement like Joe has a glass down there, it can be unclear as whether someone's presenting a proposition for discussion, making a truth or knowledge claim, or basically saying that they believe this to be true, rather than actually claiming it definitely is true. And we notice this in conversations in regards to God and gods and things like that. Generally, Dave, when someone says, you know, what are your position on gods, what do you say?
Sorry, say that again.
If we were to say, what's your position in regards to the ontology of God?
I would say God doesn't exist.
Yeah. And even in the generalistic term about all gods, you'd probably say gods don't exist, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But you're not
Yeah.
necessarily making a 100% definitive statement that you know no gods exist with that statement.
No, I'm just saying that I think it's the case that gods don't exist. Yeah.
Even if a couple of them in there, you might actually then turn around and say you know they don't exist.
Yeah, I'd say like locally atheist, but I'm also globally atheist in that I think it's highly improbable that gods don't exist.
Yeah, that's fair enough. So we can see why there's some of this confusion about this statement, because people will take this statement that Dave would say gods don't exist to mean that he's saying he either knows or it's definitely true that gods don't exist. But that isn't necessarily the case. So we know what a proposition is, and we sort of know what a claim is. A claim is basically a proposition that you're asserting to be true. And if you're making a knowledge claim, you're saying that you hold knowledge of this proposition. And we could get into whole little worlds about definitions of knowledge and various theories, but we won't go down that tonight. So let's bring things on to atheism as a proposition. So when we first discussed a proposition, we said it's a truth apt statement. So the reason atheism is, or can be, considered a proposition is because theism can be considered a proposition. Theism is often defined as the belief that at least one God exists. But an ism is a concept rather than an actual being with a psychological state. So what it's actually describing is the propositional content of that belief. It's a statement on the ontology or being of God. So the propositional content of the belief God exists is God exists. The prefix a can mean without, but is often used as not as well. Think about atypical. So the proposition being God exists, the negation of the proposition is God does not exist. The prefix a can mean not, as in negation. So it is the negation of the propositional content of theism. Therefore, not P is God does not exist. When you're answering a proposition, the idea is that you give your read on whether the proposition is true and whether the proposition is false, which is why to fully answer a proposition, you will either be in one of three states. You will affirm it, deny it, or suspend judgment on it. If you affirm it, you're saying, I believe the proposition is true. Therefore, you don't believe the proposition is false. To deny it, you're saying that I believe the proposition is false, basically. So therefore, you think it's not true. And if you're suspending judgment, you can't make up your mind either way. There are other answers that come in, but they're not answering the proposition. They're answering different things about the proposition or your general attitude, like you don't care or you don't think the proposition is well formed. So, in this sense, we can see that atheism is the opposite of theism. We know that a God either can or cannot exist, but an attitude isn't necessarily as binary. Sure, you do or don't have a particular belief, but when you're answering the proposition, you either... Sorry, I just read the chat. Do apologize that we're buffering, although I think it's your end, not ours, because I'm not dropping any frames. Hopefully, it's you. So that is why, the negation of a proposition is its own form of proposition, and you will either accept one or the other. So when you're discussing this particular thing, we can see that using propositional logic and the ways to discuss a proposition, atheism is the negation of theism. Therefore, you have God exists and God does not exist as theism and atheism, and then you've got other positions in between. Is there anything I need to add to that at this stage, Dave?
Not that I can think of.
So Chris says, I think that's where the confusion is. People seem to think the A prefix is on belief without belief, but it's not. The prefix is on the statement God exists, so without God. Yeah, or it's used as not, as in negation, in this sense. Now, don't get me wrong. Language is one of those things that is very dynamic and fluid, and they're not wrong to say that that's how they're using it. They're wrong to say that it can't be used as negation, and they're probably wrong to say it's less logical to use as negation, because using propositional logic, you can see how it would be used as negation, and we are discussing the proposition. But obviously, atheism has had a number of different definitions. I mean, the original applied to theists, people who believed in gods. So it's come a long way and taken many turns and twists over the years. And the way language works, no one is wrong. It's too easy. We need at least one more quadrant in there. You can have the delta quadrant. So Rev says, the Romans called early Christians atheists because they were without the gods being the Roman ones. Actually, yes, so if you want to discuss that one, so atheos was originally used for those who'd actually lost the favor of the gods. They could still believe, but they'd lost the favor. So you're having a spot of bad luck, you're atheos. It was then used for those that didn't believe in the gods of the state, so the pantheon. So Christians were some of the first atheos. Christians then went on to call pagans atheists, and so on and so forth. So if you want to go back that far, yeah, the original didn't have really that much in line with atheism today. Even though you might be able to get a direct translation of without gods, you're missing the original use. And this is something I try and get people to understand, because if you actually think about things like the French pomme de terre, it translates these days directly to apple of the ground. It originally translated to fruit of the ground, and it's it's a vegetable. It's not a fruit. It's a root, basically. So there you go. A direct translation of a term doesn't always work. It doesn't tell you how the term's being used or how the term was originally used. It's just, one of those things. So that's basically why atheism can be used as a proposition. So an atheist would be one that affirms the proposition of atheism. Now, this is another point where people get worried, because they think that means that you're saying it's definitely the case. They think you're making that claim. Like we discussed earlier, Dave says gods don't exist, right? I would agree with him, knowing how he means it, because we believe gods don't exist. There might be some gods that we say definitely don't exist, but in general, we believe gods don't exist. Now, the other day I got into a confusing conversation where someone said that a belief is a knowledge claim. which just is really, really, really confusing. It's not the case at all. A belief is something that you accept as true, a proposition you affirm, something you think likely. If you think that based on all the streams that you've seen, I usually have a pint filled with some liquid. So it's quite likely that I have a drink down there. And in fact, you could say, based on all the streams you've watched, it's either going to be beer or water. Right? You'd have a belief there that you think it's likely. You might not be very certain in that belief. You might suspend judgment, but it's not necessarily quite how minds work. If you've seen me, every single stream have either a beer or a water or both, you're going to think I've got one or the other down there. Now, just for the big reveal, I've got neither. I went for some summer fruits tonight. But you'd be quite justified in thinking that I had it. And this is the other point around the proposition. People are afraid of the burden of proof, mostly because of a misunderstanding of the burden of proof. Now, Dave, could you quickly just explain how the burden of proof should be understood in the terms of discussing a proposition and how it relates to a belief?
How do you mean? Sorry, carry on.
So if someone says, I believe this, how should the burden of proof apply to them?
There's a sort of internal justification that you need to do if you want to consider yourself rational. You can call it the burden of proof, you can call it the burden of justification, whichever one you prefer, but basically you have an epistemic obligation to show that your belief is rational, especially if you want to make the claim that you are a rational person.
And I think that's the bit that people misinterpret, because they think that when you say burden of proof, you have to prove this thing true. If you believe this thing, you have to prove it true. But that's not the case. I mean, even if you are asserting something is true, you don't have to do anything. But there is a higher obligation to be considered rational if you're saying something definitely is true. So a way to think about it is you have an epistemic responsibility to yourself to justify why you think something is most likely the case. So Dave was saying in a number of streams and articles, rationality is reasoning using the rules of logic and probability theory, holding consistent and coherent beliefs, having no strong evidence against your position, and so on and so forth. So if you can do those things, you consider your position at least rational. It could be wrong, but it could be rational. Now, if you're entering a conversation with someone and you're challenging their position, you sort of enter a bit of a social contract, which should let you know that if you're challenging their belief and asking them for their justification, they can do the same back, and you sort of owe it to them. And even if you're just saying, I don't accept your claim, and you're not saying you believe it's false, you're just saying I don't accept it or whatever, you're trying to suspend judgment, you still owe some justification for why you're not holding a belief that it's true or false. Because it's this, social contract, the conversation that you're in, and your epistemic responsibility, and to make sure that you are holding a rational position. So even a suspense of judgment can carry some burden. So people who are saying that, well, I only lack belief, so I don't have any burden of proof, that's wrong. because the burden of proof is just removed from proving this thing true. It's proving that your position is rational, even if it's just a suspensive judgment. There can be plenty of things where it would be irrational for you to suspend judgment on, right? I'm holding this liquid and it is red. You'd be irrational to suspend judgment on this right now. I'm sure you could think of some justifications, but largely speaking, unless you're going out there, those of you who know me well enough will know that this is generally what I'm saying it is, and so on and so forth. You can have plenty of justifications based on visual record and testimony and everything like that. Yes, liquor is an epistemic responsibility eraser. That is why it is just cordial juice tonight. Yeah. So when you say that you believe or you don't believe something, there is still some burden, right? The obligation is in first to yourself, right? If you believe or don't believe something, you have an obligation to yourself to actually have fully thought this through, as long as you care about being rational. If you want to say you're a rational being, you should be able to do this. If you want someone else to consider you a rational being, or you're challenging them and you're entering a conversation, you should be able to provide this justification that you've already given yourself to them. There's an article that I've done on Answers in Reason on why I believe gods don't exist, because I'm happy to give people that justification. Yep, there's people out there who have probably done much better work than I have, but I can at least justify my thoughts and my reasons. Is the desire to be a rational person a subjective choice? One for you, Dave. I've been talking for ages.
To some extent, yes, but also we are rational by nature, so also no.
You could also,
unless you ask somebody like Freud, who says that we're just completely irrational all the time.
You could also argue that we can't control our desires, so there's no real choice in it at all.
Exactly. Asking these kind of simple questions around here, you don't get no simple answers.
So also Reason to Doubt says, can we make the theists... Oh, hang on. Let me try and click that again. Can we make the theists who insist atheists prove that God doesn't exist, and the atheists who insist that God doesn't exist fight to the death? I mean, we can. I should read that again. Can we make the theists who insist atheists prove God doesn't exist, and the atheists who insist that God fight to the death? I suppose it insists that, and that was like a half thought. Insist that theists prove that he doesn't exist. There we go. I didn't see your subsequent message. No wonder I was getting confused reading that. Throw me off, why don't you? Yeah, I mean, I'd rather just try and educate them. But yeah, as Dave says, as long as it's done through pay-per-view and the profits go to helping the poor, and buying us green screens. How are things going on in Answers in Season today? Yeah, very good. This season I will mostly be wearing beanies and hoodies, and yes, that's pretty much the entire season done in one go. There will be an array of colours. They will be black or burgundy, occasionally green. Answers in teasing. Hello. Da, 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 da. Um, so that you know, the hiding behind a "I just don't believe you" doesn't absolve you of any epistemic responsibility, at least not to yourself. And if you're engaging in a conversation with someone, then you have sort of entered a social contract, and you should uphold your end.
A discursive obligation, it's called.
Oh, there you go. Because why are you getting involved in a conversation and then refusing to actually have that conversation? It seems a bit strange if you're just going to go get into a conversation. I mean, imagine if we applied it to other things. Dave, what did you do at the weekend?
Got fatter.
I don't believe you.
Okay.
Yeah. Like, prove it, Dave. Prove it.
Okay. That's usually my general response to people like that is, okay.
Yeah. It's pointless, really. I mean, it can just kill a conversation, and you just wouldn't treat it that way in a conversation. You'd have a discussion no matter what it was about. I mean, whether you're interpreting some plot in a movie or you're discussing something else, there's more to a conversation than, well, I don't believe it, or prove it, prove your claim. So when you're entering a conversation with someone, you should probably try and do a little bit more than just going prove it. So, Dave, having discussed what a proposition is and how atheism can be a proposition and the burden that proposition can bear, and how saying you just don't believe doesn't absolve anyone of that burden. Next, I think we should consider some of the problems and benefits that you can have with the different definitions. So, why do you prefer using atheism as a proposition?
Mostly because I generally do philosophy, and that's generally the way it's used in philosophy. But also, it allows for more nuanced positions, and it allows for describing attitudes towards particular things. So, atheism is an attitude towards the proposition God exists.
Mm-hmm.
Agnosticism is an attitude towards the proposition God exists. And so you have these various terms, and they all sort of describe the attitudes. If you think of something like aliens exist, there's kind of three choices there. There's yes, they exist. No, they don't. That's it as far as ontologically, but epistemically, there's also yes, I believe aliens exist. No, I don't believe aliens exist, or I believe aliens don't exist, or I'm unsure. So using it in the sense of a proposition means we can actually have various different stances.
Or it depends what you mean by an alien. If you're just talking about, microbes, microbiological life, then yeah, but if you're talking about some other form of being, well, you haven't really provided me a coherent definition. So I think that proposition is meaningless until you tell me exactly what you mean by an alien, which is kind of how agnosticism is applied to the proposition of gods, isn't it? So
it is, yeah. It's the stance that it's a meaningless thing. It's the claim or the proposition God exists is a non-cognitive kind of thing. It's not one that we can actually reason about. God damn flickering There we go. Yeah, it's not something that we can actually reason about because there is no actual coherent definition of the term God. And when people say that they believe God exists, you could say that it's a form of expressivism because it can't be a cognitive thing.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense to me. So another thing that you mentioned there, you sort of alluded to the fact that it allows for more nuanced positions, which is something that I also like. It allows you to understand and make more accurate inferences about what someone does and does not believe based on a label. If you have, say, atheism purely as a lack of belief, it, basically non-theism as it is. If atheism is non-theism, then it's really broad. All you can really say is that they don't have the belief a God exists. And that statement can be so broad that people then make really weird claims that babies, rocks, Bibles, churches, and all sorts are atheist. Which you could argue, yes, if all it takes to be atheist is lacking that belief, if that's the only parameter, then yeah, but you can see that that's not really the only parameter. Even by the people who say atheism is only a lack of belief in gods, most of them will say that, well, it's a person. An atheist is a person that lacks belief in gods, because there is a relationship between an ist and an ism. See, especially in the way these sorts of concepts are used, an ist follows an ism. So a communist follows the tenets of communism. A theist follows the tenets of theism. A leftist, conservatist, whatever. They all
An agnostic follows the tenets of agnosticism.
Well, there's an article that I have, Why Agnostic Are Not Agnosticist, that looks in depth about why that one sort of breaks the rule. I mean, there are exceptions to the rule, but agnostic is more of an adjective. It's describing a psychological state. So apart from hard agnosticism, there is no real proposition of agnosticism. So it isn't a real ism to follow. But anyway, the reason you have this is, the ist to ism, that there's an actual following of. So that is why, I mean, even if you look it up in the dictionary, well, definition of ist, it'll say you can't be born an ist because you're not born following anything, right? So if you're an ist, it shows that you're following. So even if atheism is this lack of belief definition, to be an ist, you have to consciously lack belief. There is that still following of that particular tenet. So that is something that people can think about this only a lack of belief, because even the people that say it's only a lack of belief will say, well, it's not that. There is one thing or another. You have to be a person. And some don't, obviously. That's why you get people making claims like rocks are atheist. But anyway, essentially, if you broaden the term atheist that much, it loses all real meaning. What does it actually mean? Well, it means you could be a rock, or you could claim gods don't exist, or it could mean that you're suspending judgment, or it could... There's no way to accurately infer what someone does and doesn't believe about that proposition. Whereas the individual labels allow us to do that. If you're using the terms, agnostic as someone who suspends judgment, they're not sure whether it's true or false. They have considered it. They do think the proposition is true, but they're not sure one way or the other. We know that an agnostic thinks the proposition is meaningless. We know an atheist is someone that thinks that they just don't really care about the proposition enough to consider it. So they don't care whether gods exist or don't, so they don't consider it. We know innocents are those that either lack the cognitive abilities to consider the proposition and hold beliefs one way or the other, or people who have never heard the proposition. So babies and people who have never heard of or thought about gods, right? So that is one of the key reasons, I think, and I think Dave thinks, this definition in the propositional sense is better over the other senses. There's also other problems that you can come across, though, when you're using these other definitions, aren't there, Dave?
The lack of belief one?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it can be kind of ambiguous, I guess. In other words, like if somebody says, does God exist? And they say, I'm an atheist, I lack belief in God. Well, you're not really answering that question then. You would then have to give a slightly different answer, not revolving around your atheism. Whereas if you used it in the sense of a proposition, does God exist? I'm an atheist. And you're actually putting forward the meaning of God doesn't exist when you say atheist. I subscribe to the proposition God doesn't exist. You are kind of answering that question.
Yep, that makes sense. There's also other problems that come about. If atheism can be described as just a lack of belief in gods, you're saying that you're essentially in that position where the agnostic doesn't believe God exists, doesn't believe God does not exist. You're saying atheism is just not believing God exists. It's not holding that belief. Therefore, you're holding that same position that the agnostic has, but just calling it atheism. That's fine. You can do that if you want. So you don't have this belief. You're here. You don't believe either way. You just lack a belief. You lack both beliefs. Fine. Okay. But then if you're saying if atheism is just a lack of belief in gods, then if a theist wanted to say, well, theism is just a lack of belief gods don't exist, then you'd have to agree, okay, yeah, otherwise you'd be special pleading. I know theists don't do this, but I'm just saying, if you don't allow for this, then you'd be saying that you would be special pleading. You'd be holding them to a different standard. No, you have to define your word based on what you believe, and I define mine on what I lack belief in. Okay. The problem is, if you then do let them, and you're no longer special pleading, you end up in a point where you've got a bit of a contradiction, because you've already said that you don't hold this belief that gods don't exist and this belief that gods exist. So you're in this middle position where the agnostics would usually sit, and they're saying that they're in that position too. And so theists and atheists what? Are the same thing? Theistic atheists and atheistic theist? And what? That is another point of confusion. You either end up special pleading and holding them to a different standard, or allowing to a point where you allow contradiction to happen. Neither of these are good positions to be in. So it is kind of crap, to say the least.
Yeah, if your definitions mean that you're calling a religion an atheist or atheistic, not because that it promotes not believing in God or promotes the idea of God doesn't exist, but because the religion itself lacks a belief in God, then there's probably something wrong with your terminology.
Yeah, I mean
If you're
that's
calling church atheistic, there's something wrong with your definitions and terminology.
yeah, because that's something that you would say, like, when you're applying terms like theistic and atheistic to inanimate objects, you're not talking about a belief they hold. You're talking about a belief they promote or what goes on there. So
The type of content it is, yeah.
So if it was an atheistic church, then you'd be saying it's a church for an atheist religion, rather than a church for Christians. But a church doesn't hold beliefs. So if you're using the terminology where the way certain big names use it, a church, if atheism is only a lack of belief and things like rocks are atheists, then churches, by that definition, are atheists. And religions, by that definition, are atheists. And Bibles and Qurans and everything like that are atheists. Which shows a massive issue, as Dave said. And I mean, Dave, you've done a video on this called The Ridiculousness of Atheist Rocks. Definitely something everyone should check out. And you've also done an article on it. There's also a couple of articles about atheism as the default position and things like that are worth checking out too. Just catching up on the chat. Luke says, my pet peeve is I only lack belief in your fairy tale sky daddy, so you actually believe God doesn't exist. Yeah, so this is something that you get a lot of our fellow atheists saying, in the sense that they will say, like, gods are imaginary, or they'll call gods fairy tale sky daddies, or things like that. So they're actually making a statement that they believe this being is false. They're not saying that, well, I'm uncertain. They're saying they're certain to a certain degree that this being has no objective reality. You know, imaginary or fairy tale is something without an objective reality. It's just a story. Therefore, if you're saying that it's just a story, it's part of your imagination or whatever, you hold the belief that this thing doesn't exist. Now, depending on where your understanding is, we know that there's various confused things, like some people saying a belief is a knowledge claim and all sorts, but wherever you sit on that, you're actually being dishonest by saying, I only lack belief in this circumstance and similar ones to it. You're not upholding your epistemic responsibility. You're not being honest. You're not engaging honestly. You're not actually having the conversation in the way you ought. Is there anything you'd add to that one, Dave?
No, not really.
Yeah. So Reason to Doubt says, yeah, a lot of black theists seem to be disingenuous when claiming they are undecided. Completely agree with you. Rev says they're absolutely dishonest. They are defending a position rather than explaining their belief. Yeah, they're fighting it. They're not even defending the position well. They're literally trying to defend the position by putting all the responsibility on someone else. And that isn't how to defend a position.
Well, a lot of black theists will argue that the reason they prefer the term atheist to agnostic is because they're not fence sitters. They're not saying that, you know, it's possible God exists. They're not in the middle or undecided. They choose the term atheist because it's a stronger position, and it denotes more than just being undecided on God. But then when their feet are held to the fire, it's, well, I'm not saying God doesn't exist. I'm just saying I lack belief. It's like, well, do you mean that God is possible? No, God's not possible. I mean, you've got the classic Aaron Ra thing there. I'm not saying gods are impossible. I'm not. Yeah, what was it? I'm not saying gods are impossible. I'm just saying that God isn't possible.
Yeah.
It's not possible for God to exist. Yeah.
Yeah, they're not impossible, they're just not possible, or something like that. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a paraphrase, but he basically contradicted himself in his statement. It's like when people say, I don't believe in evolution, I just accept the facts of evolution. You're like, okay. I don't believe, I only accept, I hold no beliefs, and all those contradictory statements. Yeah. If you can find that quote as well, that's brilliant. Kimo says that's pretty much McRae's semantic collapse argument, and it's correct. Yeah, I mean, it's true. You end up in a form of special pleading, or a contradiction where the terms essentially collapse into that form. But yeah. Reason to Doubt says, I used to use that terminology, but was confused on belief versus knowledge, and it's a good thing Dave and Joe set me straight. Thank you very much for that. It is interesting that particular confusion. I mean, I used to, when I first joined the debating world, I was corrected on my definition of atheism to the lack of belief definition, and that's what all the other atheists were saying. And at that time, I thought, oh, I'd obviously just got it wrong up until now, because so many people had told me that, oh no, this is it. So I switched my terminology up, and I can understand that when there's a circle of people saying that, how easy it is to sort of be influenced by that. Oh, okay, so it is this. But yeah, I mean, we've all got different reasons. We've all got different stories. I think the important thing is that we can learn and grow, and some people do. And hopefully we all continue doing it, and that's what it's about. Rev is lying. It
wasn't my circumference growing.
Well, your brain's big enough already.
I don't have a brain.
Rev is accusing us of not being a twat. Rev is also saying,
how dare he? I've spent many years being a cunt, you know. Also, your mic's gone.
On a few different
Oh, there we go. You're back now.
Tell me if it is.
You cut out for ages there.
Looking into it or anything.
Can you hear me?
And Srida says, most lacktheism or so-called American atheists are actually agnostic, but they don't like that because two Americans, it's fence-sitting and not making decision. And two, they've been indoctrinated by a political organization who don't mind lying to them. Yeah, I mean, there's a few things that we can unpack there. So I will say that I think that most of the so-called American atheists, I don't actually think they're necessarily locally agnostic. I think a lot of them have come from a form of theism. And sorry, what was that going on? Ignoring you, Dave.
Well, your mic you cut out, and I was trying to tell you.
I can't hear you.
Speaking, and can't you hear me?
You're coming. Well, you're not coming through to me. Hang on a second, Dave. Let's have a look. Oh yeah. Can everybody hear Dave but me? Why has it got to happen all the time? Try again now, Dave. No.
Can you hear me?
Still.
Can you hear me?
Coming through. I've apparently lost Dave's audio. That's good, isn't it? Just what you need. So let's see. Dave Cam Let's see what happens if I do this. Let's try again, Dave.
Hello.
Nope. Let me switch it to monitor off. Monitor and output back on. Try again, Dave.
Hello.
No, you're not coming out for some reason. Let me quickly switch the logo.
You're back.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Hang on. I still can't hear Dave. Basically, all the sound on my computer had gone, but I'd got that back all of a sudden, but I had to switch headphones. But you are still not coming through, Dave.
Can you hear me? Well, they can hear me.
I'm off, monitor and output, global settings.
I'm being silenced.
There you are. I can hear you at last.
He was silencing me.
Okay, so that was really weird. I seem to be having problems with USB. I think I need to update some drivers. Yeah, what? Yeah, I think I've got too many USB things plugged in. Basically, I think that's what it is, and it's starting to overload the system. It's the problem when you've got 2 mice, 2 keyboards, sound system, 3 sets of headphones, DJ equipment, lights, and all sorts all plugged in. Yeah. So where was I? We had. Where is it? We were discussing Ansfrida's comment about most Theism so-called American atheists are actually agnostic, but they don't like it because 1, to Americans it's fence-sitting and not making a decision, and 2, they've been indoctrinated by political organization who don't mind lying to them. So Dave, you were apparently saying something, so would you like to say what you were saying first, and then I will get back to...
I can't remember what it was now. Oh, that's
my
what
god, I
was
can't
saying.
hear you again. What the hell is going on, Dave?
I'd tell you, but you wouldn't hear me if I did.
Global settings. Dave, can you talk again?
Again?
Yeah, there you go. Right, I'm just going to leave the audio settings open on slobs, because anytime I close the audio settings, I seem to lose you. So yes,
Yeah,
what were you
what I
saying?
was saying was that your microphone had cut out and I couldn't hear you. And then apparently you couldn't hear me while I was trying to tell you.
Right. And apparently people could hear me and they could hear you, but we just couldn't hear each other. I think this is an indication that the this feature that Streamlabs have released, where you can have a camera directly ported in, a guest directly in, instead of having to use some external software to do it, is not quite there yet. And we'll next week we will, or our next stream is going to be done through Restream anyway, because we've got a couple of guests. But anyway, here we go. So I would suggest that they're not necessarily locally atheists. I think most of the American atheists that I talk to that claim to only lack a belief in God believe that the Christian God does not exist, or the Abrahamic God does not exist, because they call it an imaginary sky daddy, so on and so forth. I would say that they seem to have this belief God does not exist. Or that God anyway, but they may be fence sitting on a larger scale. They might be globally agnostic. And as you say that they've been indoctrinated by a political organization who don't mind lying to them, I'm not entirely sure all of them have. I think the influence is there from places like the American Atheists. But I don't think it's necessarily people are like members of it or listen to everything they say. I think it's an influence that's grown out from shows like the Atheist Experience and following some of the bigger names in atheist activism in America, and how this has then come to be something that has influenced others who may not have even heard of these people, and that's why they're saying, no, it's only a lack of belief. If you're not in the middle, then you don't just lack a belief. I yell it past me. Kimo, atheist just sounds edgier than agnostic. Chicks dig it. I think there is some sort of aesthetic component to wanting to be known as an atheist, even if you don't hold to the definition that we do. And there's this emotional rejection for, well, if you use that definition, that means I'm not an atheist under your definition, and I want to be an atheist. There's not a rational definition. It's I want to be an atheist. You know, I am an atheist. That's what I am. Well, surely the position is what's important, regardless of the label. You know, I don't really care what the label is, but it makes sense that it's something that accurately describes your position, which is why I don't think anti-theist suits my position, because if you break down the words, it means someone who is against theists or theism, someone that's against the belief in God, someone that's against organized religion. Different ways you can take it, but I'm not necessarily against theism in general. There's certain religious practices, of course, but that's why anti-theist doesn't work for me, and that's why I don't want that label. It's not no, I want to be an atheist. It's this label doesn't really describe me. But if they came up with something else that, I don't know, had a different route that happened to be the same as the belief gods don't exist, or the proposition gods don't exist for atheists and atheism, but with something else, I wouldn't care, because as long as it accurately describes the position, then at the end of the day, as long as people know what you mean, that's the important thing. The label isn't important. but there is this aesthetic that people seem to go for, this super smart, rational, skeptic style aesthetic, isn't there, Dave?
There definitely is.
I thought
Sort
I
of
was checking
same
for a
with.
second.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there definitely is. There was the marketing was very good in the push when atheism became popular with Dawkins and Hitchens and all that. They made people think that being theist was synonymous with being irrational, and being atheist was synonymous with being rational and smart and cultured and a critical thinker. And really, when people want to, a lot of people want to look good, don't they? So it's easier to say I'm an atheist and therefore I represent all these qualities than it is to actually be all those qualities. And I think a lot of people grab onto atheism for a similar reason to that.
Yeah, most definitely. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, there are some benefits to the broader terminology as well. I'm not just going to sit here and rip on it, even though it deserves it. If you're having a conversation where everybody is using a term that way, then it makes sense to use that term. So on social media, if someone identifies as atheist, I mean, generally the only thing you can tell is that they don't hold a belief in gods. They're basically describing non-theist, right? Fine. That's what they're saying. So it could be said that even if you are an agnostic or an agnostic or something like that, but you go into a location or a conversation where everybody is using atheist to mean non-theist, you could argue that it makes sense, at least at the start, to say, okay, well, yeah, by your definition, I'm an atheist. Well, for this conversation, we'll use your definition of atheist. It helps you be understood by them. And then you can sort of draw their attention to how you use the terms. So one of the points of language is being understood. And if you go into a location where everybody is using a term a certain way and turn around and say, no, that's wrong, that's not how it's used, then you're not going to get a good response. But even when you say, yeah, no, that is one way atheism is used, it's also used this way, this way, this way, you get a lot of resistance, don't you, Dave? There's a lot of people. I mean, this comes back to the aesthetic thing, I'm sure, more than anything else. But you get a lot of people who are like that. I can't move my mouse at the moment. There it is. Needed to get that comment off the screen. I couldn't do anything. But so I suppose there's a benefit from a conversation on social media, identifying as an atheist in that sense. It could at least help the conversation progress. You're not quibbling over definitions, unless that's the conversation that you want to have. The thing to remember is there is no right or wrong definition. There's just a preferred one, and one that you can justify more over the other. And as we've done so far, Dave said, within most philosophical literature, it is used as a proposition. When it's used as a proposition, it adheres to the rules of logic. It's the more logical definition in that regard, because the other one is just a psychological state, whereas atheism as a proposition and atheist as a position is an epistemic answer on, the ontology of the God being. It allows for more nuanced positions to come up. So there's a lot of clear, concise definitions that you can use to allow you to accurately infer what someone does and does not believe about a proposition. It stops people from making stupid statements like rocks are atheist. It also stops the conversation about babies being atheist. It stops conversation about atheism being the default position, and animals being atheists and all that other crap. So it's a lot better in that regard as well. It shows a greater understanding of, logic and the history of the various bits of terminology. It probably shows an understanding, or at least a better understanding of the burden of proof or epistemic justification.
Your microphone's cut out again.
Am I back? Yes, I'm back. Right. I'm not sure what it is, but I almost think it's one of my mice. So I'm going to unplug that one. But this actually happened with my last sound card. I don't know if you remember it when it was dying and it kept on cutting off. So it could be that this sound card is starting to die and I really can't afford a new one right now. I might just have to get a decent USB mic and scratch this from my setup if it's going to start having these problems. So Dave, were there any other benefits to the propositional use than those I mentioned?
No, not really. No, without thinking about it a little deeper.
And it's too late for you to think anymore.
It is.
So and Sfrida says something like, I'm not saying gods are impossible, I'm just saying the biblical God is impossible, much as I know the leprechauns are impossible. Was that the actual quote? I swear it was a little bit more concise than that. I swear I saw it on a stream or something where he said, I'm not saying gods are impossible, I'm just saying they're not possible. But fair, maybe. I mean, that statement that you wrote there is better, because that's saying that, you're not saying that gods in general are impossible, just a particular god is impossible. That would mean that he is saying that he believes that God does not exist. And for him to actually say it's impossible, he'd have to, justify why to be completely rational. Chris says, in Lacktheism, many things are atheistic as well, as Rakana frames it. Yeah, see, that's one of the things that I was talking about. You end up with people saying things like rocks are atheists, and then that if a rock is an atheist, a brick is an atheist, a building is an atheist, that means a church is an atheist, a Bible is an atheist, or atheistic, whatever you want to say. But yeah, it's ridiculous. Propositions are atheists. yeah.
They kind of are. And in fact, you could get really technical and say that most theists are 99.99 recurring % atheist.
Because of all of their atoms.
Yeah.
None of their atoms hold that belief.
Even their belief that God exists is atheistic, because the belief itself doesn't hold the belief.
Brilliant. Oh, the chat's just suddenly jumped. Command Cyborg, what did you miss? Nothing, you know it all already, but thank you for coming.
He didn't miss JFK, according to the news reports.
Really?
He was right on target.
Luke says, yeah, they just made it seem like just being an atheist makes you a critical thinker automatically. Yeah, you're right there. That is something that you actually see a lot of atheists make similar statements or drop memes that sort of about how atheists and atheism, they're more intelligent, they're more rational, more moral, and all sorts. So I think that it's fair to say that this statement is at least somewhat erroneous. Just a bit. And I think that to act, yeah. I can understand sometimes some atheists have spent a lot of time thinking about their theism and they have applied good skepticism. Not all of them, but let's just say some atheists have applied a lot of good skepticism and ended up thinking that, gods likely don't exist. The problem is, because of this attitude that's out there that, atheists are, this smarter, more critical thinker type thing, they sometimes think that because they've been a good skeptic, they are always a good skeptic. Therefore, what they think about things is always showing good skepticism. Therefore, if anyone says something differently, then they're wrong. And they're not applying good skepticism anymore. They're not applying good critical thinking. They just go, I'm a good skeptic, therefore I'm right about whatever I say. And actually being a good skeptic, part of it at least, is having a bit of epistemic humility and realizing that even if we have applied incredibly good skepticism to reach a certain position, we still could be wrong, and there might be something we should reconsider. And we're human, we're fallible. We're never going to be completely right all the time.
Speak for yourself.
Being an atheist makes your IQ go double digits. The reason chicks dig Jesus is because it's the only way to find him these days. Being an atheist does make you a critical thinker automatically, doesn't it? It also makes you extra virulent and attractive to your most favorite sexual partners. Brilliant. It worked for me, Icarus. I previously scored 5 on my IQ test, and then I became an atheist, and now I'm 15. I'm first to Lord Anthony Flew for describing and coining the no true Scotsman manoeuvre, but he went right off the wells with presumption of atheism paper. It lit a fire under this mess. I mean, it did light a fire under the mess, but actually, I think what he was trying to do was sort of better than most people realize, because we did a little stream on it and we sort of skimmed through his paper. And what he was trying to achieve was almost his negative atheism wasn't the same as agnosticism. It was closer to ignosticism with a method of investigation, and tell me more about this God, and how shall we actually describe these attributes and make it so it makes sense to me, because right now I haven't heard anything that actually makes sense about the God character. And you know what? If most lacktheists acted that way, they'd be having better conversations. So there you go. I thought my thing went off the Raz then. And Frida comes back and confirms what we were talking about earlier. I have heard Raz say that, but he may well have said something very dim at other times. He often has, but yes. As Hitchens said, our belief is not a belief. Our principles are not a faith. Yeah. We do not rely solely upon science and reason because these are necessary rather than sufficient factors, but we distrust anything that contradicts science or outrages reason. Yeah, I mean, that second part's not too bad, but our belief is not a belief. Yeah. You can have a charitable reading of that and understand what he's getting at, but I think that's what leads people to just then go, we have no beliefs. Chris, have yourself a good night. Thank you very much for joining us. And sorry about what you're having to go to tomorrow. All the best. Okay, so we've discussed atheism as a proposition and the benefits to using this and the issues with some of the other definitions. Is there anything else that we should cover off tonight, Dave, about this particular one?
Not that I can think of.
Awesome. Well, in that case, I think before we sign off, there is something we need to cover, and that's, folks, Thursday we are streaming with Reason to Doubt. They're an awesome little YouTube show and podcast that I think that you guys will love. If you haven't checked them out already, honestly, they're really, really entertaining, and I can't wait to have them on. And we're going to be discussing, what gave them reason to doubt in the first place. So, like we've had conversations with Emerson and Rev before, we are going to be investigating a bit about them on a personal level and theological level, and what led them to atheism and doing their podcast and what they hope to achieve from that sort of thing. And I'm really, 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 really looking forward to having them on. They seem like absolutely great guys. I'm sure it'll be a good laugh. So hopefully you guys will be here Thursday at 9 p.m. to check that out. And yeah, that's it from me. Dave, any last thoughts before we sign off?
Nope.
Cool. In that case, I think you folks should check out the Psyched stream that Luke just did on Monday about Machiavellism. It's the part 3 of his Dark Triad series, and he wraps everything up quite nicely there. Make sure you check out the stream with Reason to Doubt too.